right, so behind this menu, for those online who can't see it, it's just that loading menu. There we go. All right, cool. So dive straight into it. On the screen. So I had a look at when I last presented at an SES seminar, and it was back in 2019. I still use that profile picture. I think I will for the next 10 years at least. I'm not as great there. So it was 2019, I think one of the very first revamped SES seminars, so early that it's not actually recorded anyway. But I kind of wanted to give you guys a quick update before I dive into this study on what I've been doing since then. So following up 2019, we're relatively happy. We, of course, then had lockdown, which I think that was one of the only photos I can find. Probably reflected my feelings of being locked in my garage there. And I don't know what happened in 2021. It seemed to get worse and worse. That's SDC at the first half of the year. But luckily, halfway through 2021 and lockdown, everything shifted a fair bit. And, I was lucky enough to have baby Dottie.
Before June or after June?
This is probably 2 weeks after she was born, and the other one maybe a month before she was born. Yes.
Okay.
The following 2 years, so you can see a bit of a shift again. I don't like to look the same each year. But probably the biggest milestone for me was enrolling in and completing a Master of Data Science through University of New South Wales, which was challenging, but I was really glad that I got through that and graduated, finished at the end of last year, graduated and started this year. During this time, I've also been lucky enough to have amongst honours and master's students from the analytics program 4 PhD students. The first of which, Sue's, we're hopefully tomorrow, early next week, looking at submitting, which would be absolutely fantastic, but also Jack, Dave, and James, who are all on board now. Which brings us to 5 years later, where I'm doing an SES seminar again. So a roundabout way of what I've been doing. What I'm going to talk about today is a presentation I gave at the World Congress of Science and Football last year in Groningen. I've added 2 slides to it because everyone knows I like to rant a little bit and wanted to add a little bit of flavour to it. So the first thing I just wanted to touch on was the state of what I consider to be the state of sports science or performance analysis research. I've added the sports science, not just performance analysis. My background, I guess, is more exercise physiology, then applied sports science. I'd say sports analytics, but then it's historically performance analysis as well. But you'll look through the research, and what I'm really talking about with this type of research is descriptive research, where it's a case of, hey, I have data from an elite sports team, let's publish it. And there's no research question these days. It just seems to be, I've got data available, and most of you heard me give this example. It's like me going and looking at my Garmin and saying, I'm going to download my runs from the last 3 months and make some nice graphs, and I'm going to publish it. Like, I could run some stats on it, I could work some stuff out, but is it really of interest, or is it just me having data and thinking, hey, that makes research? So you want to make sure you've got a good research question. Now, I'm going to pick on a study, but I'm not going to name it. Just to show you, I guess this kind of is the epitome for me of what I don't like to see with performance analysis research. So for this study, you've got their objective there, and it is a while ago, but it was just to look at the distance covered in soccer players using an Amisco system, which is an optical tracking system. There's no real question there. They just wanted to look at the distances covered by professional soccer players. But then if we look at the subjects, so the participants, they had 31 players from one team, and they looked at 4 matches. Now, at most, you've got only outfield players, so you've got 10 outfield players at start, and you've got, at this time, 3 substitutes. So if they've had 31 players come through, then over those 4 games, they've had at least 2 very different teams. I don't know how that works with just a single team playing in a cup competition. But what they're going to get from that's not going to be very representative or generalisable to people. And it's fine depending on what they actually did in the paper. While I was looking at this again, and this is just more of an aside and a tip for people, when you are going to publish something and want to keep team confidentiality, don't refer to the team that authorised that confidentiality in the previous sentence. So that was just something I spotted in this paper. I tend to use as a journal club example of what not to do. I hadn't actually picked up on this one before. But my main message from this was when you look at their discussion or conclusions, the main thing they picked out was that in this case, their attacking players covered twice the distance in sprints compared to the midfielders. And it's a very difficult sentence stuff written there, but they're kind of getting at this information to be used by coaches to inform their training. Now, given that they've only got 4 matches, they've got 31 players, it's not going to be very generalizable. And in this case, for this type of descriptive research, I don't think those results are the practical application or the takeaway for researchers and practitioners. So this kind of focus on the quality of some of this research was touched upon over 10 years ago by Chris Carling. It's a really good opinion article where it does look at, in particular, performance analysis or physical performance match analysis research, where a lot of the papers come to conclusions that are either very, very obvious or not really adding to the area. And is that case of, I have data, let's publish it. So I guess my philosophy around this is I do think descriptive research can still be useful, but it's how you frame it and what that research question is. So for me, the way I like to approach things is that applied research in team sports in particular should be something that people can go and apply to their own teams, whether it be a practitioner or a researcher. I think descriptive research can be used, and not necessarily for the results from whichever team it was in your study, but to showcase, the results showcase the maybe new methods of analysis that you're doing. And then the practical application to the reader becomes taking your methods and applying them themselves, not necessarily your results. And there's been studies that have shown that we looked at one team, and whenever they played against a team that was above them, they ran more, and below them, they ran less. And that's fine, but that just might be the way that team plays. That shouldn't be the take home that somebody goes and then tailors all their training around that. So that's my rant beforehand. And then I wanted to present to you guys a case study that was actually part of Marika and Giamoralis's Master of Sports Analytics students project 2 years ago that me and Dave Carey worked on to show how we can get descriptive research and really promote the method that we're using. So to open it up, think of this question: how do players in team sport generally sprint? What comes to mind? The graph there is a 30-metre all-out effort. We've got distance on the x-axis, speed, velocity on the y-axis. And if we think about this is 20-metre sprint, which we have in the AFL draft. From a static position, all-out effort, what does that look like? Well, that's our traditional sprint testing. And so when we talk to someone about sprints, is that what they think of? Starting from a static start, going over 20 metres, however far. It's very different to when we refer to sprinting in games in match analysis papers. Because what that typically does, we have usually either an absolute or a individualized threshold. Here it's an absolute one. Okay, I'm going to say that a sprint is anything above 7 meters per second, which is roughly 25.1 kilometers an hour, I think. And we're going to say anytime they're above that threshold for a certain amount of time, it's a sprint effort. What does that look like compared to sprint testing from a static start? Well, I want you to watch this player in the red square. When I play the video, they're considered above 7 meters per second the entire time. So it's not really an acceleration component there. It is, they've already done that. That sprint effort is quantifying just when they're above 7 meters per second. Now, depending on the coach, when you talk to them about a sprint, are they thinking of a traditional sprint from a static start? Are they thinking about when a player is already moving? Okay. Should we be looking at those elements individually or in combination? So if we look through the research in this space, because that start point is really the acceleration component, there's been over almost 15 years ago now, research looking at accelerations in Australian football, the number of efforts broken down by quarters in football and in soccer. There's been a similar thing with sprint efforts. And you can see here in the graph on the right, these are individual sprint efforts binned into different distances, 0 to 5, 5 to 10 meters, and so on, with majority of sprints, and these are in-game sprints like this, being over very short distances. And maybe this leads to some of the confusion on why we should only do sprint testing over 20 meters, because people are getting confused with, oh, we're only sprinting, 5, 10, 15 meters, but it's not considering that lead in or acceleration component. So this stuff has really been looked at in isolation. Okay. But to his credit, DeSalvo's paper did start to explore the idea of not just looking at sprints, but how you get there. And what they did in their study, I think it's the same one, they took the sprints and they looked at how people were leading into this. Did they do an explosive sprint, which I think the way they quantified it, if I remember correctly, they didn't actually look at the acceleration, but they looked at how quickly you pass through the speed threshold below a sprint. And if you pass through it really quickly, it's an explosive sprint. Otherwise, it's a leading sprint. And you can see that the majority of sprints, the greater percentage, is slowly or having a slow lead into that sprint effort. So that brought us to the study that America, Dave and I looked at, which was around doing this similar combination of accelerations and sprints, and I refer to it as the lead into a sprint, to quantify this for individual sprint efforts in Australian footballers. So the way we did this, we just had one team. We got a season's worth of data. So over that entire season, we had data from 37 players over 22 games. Movement data was collected by the Catapult Vector S7 devices. These are both GPS and LPS. Because games are sometimes played in a stadium with a closed roof, they'll sometimes have GPS, they'll sometimes have LPS. We have combined the data set here. So we've got 14 games with GPS, 8 with LPS. Exported all the data, analysed it in R. And the idea was to identify sprint efforts, identify the accelerations, and then combine them for a full sprint profile. I want to show you the method of how we went about doing this, because I think it always helps to see it visually. So in this graph, this is a single, what I would call sprint effort pulled out from the data set that happened in a game. You can see the duration on the bottom and the speed on the y-axis. So what we would do, we used an absolute threshold. Okay, and I know there's always arguments for and against whether you do it relative to the player's maximal speed or not. Just as a point of reference, I actually looked at all the players, all 37 players' maximum speeds over the season. If we take 80% of their maximal speed, then all of them would have above 7 meters per second. So what that at least means is all of the players were capable of getting above this fixed threshold. Okay, I won't dive into the whole argument of do we use absolute or relative, but that's what we use. So anything above that line is a sprint. For at least 0.5 seconds, just to be safe that it's not just oscillating around that line there. To identify the sprint effort, and then we looked at the acceleration data. We smoothed it a little bit, just using a 5-point rolling average. So you can see we've got acceleration in red there. We identified the start of the sprint effort and then worked our way backwards, looking at acceleration until it was less than 0 meters per second. And we said that this was then the start of the lead into the sprint. And there's limitations around that, but effectively, we then get left with this. That is our full sprint profile. It's a sprint plus the lead in. So what did we then see? So from the 22 games, 37 players, all up, we had just under 4,500 efforts. You can see a breakdown of all the players here, and each dot represents how many sprints or sprint plus lead-ins they had per game. So on average, 9, but you can see how much variation there is both within and between players. Now, some of that is probably due to this not being relative to time. So if a player's only had 1 or 2 sprints, maybe they only played 10 or 15 minutes, but you can see that, this probably does need to be looked at on an individual basis because there's so much variation going on here. And obviously there'll be the positional differences and so on. If we look at the sprint efforts only, okay, the distance covered, similar to what has previously been reported, sprint distances for each effort, the majority of them seem to be around 5 to 10 meters, and the duration of under 3 seconds for the most part. If we look at the lead-ins, there's actually a similar profile. The lead-in distance before they hit that sprint speed, it is typically 10 to 25 meters, and probably between 1 to 4 seconds there. But if we combine them, we can then see that as expected. It's just going to add to the distance, it's going to add to the duration. But the sprint efforts here plus lead in, we're probably looking around anywhere between 20 to 50, 55 meters. But again, there's a lot of variation there, but we did see a nice distribution from both the distances and the durations. So if we take this a step further, what this trace is all 4,000 and so sprints put on the one graph, just to show you what each of those individual sprints look like, currently aligned to when they began the acceleration. But I think a cleaner way of looking at that is to align it based on when they hit sprint speed. And again, this shows you that some players would take 12 seconds to lead into that sprint, others would get there within 2 seconds. Okay, so again, breaking showing that variation and different ways people reach or obtain a sprint speed in game. This is just picking out one player in the 12 efforts that they performed in a game. And again, that within player variation, you can see that second bottom on the left, they've got a very slow lead in, or not slow, a very long lead in to that sprint effort. They're not in that sprint zone for very long, but it's about 8 seconds to get in versus the middle graph down the bottom there, which is probably the closest we might have to a traditional sprint. They're starting from a relatively static start. They're getting to that speed within 2 to 3 seconds. So we have our example of a leading and an explosive sprint, similar to what DeSalvo is showing in the football soccer players. We can look at commencement speed. I do think there's some limitations with this, given that we're only starting the lead in when acceleration is less than 0. So it doesn't really account for maybe somebody oscillating around and having a true lead in. But you can see that it's you're getting people starting these lead ins from a range of speeds, all the way from a static start up to, these are the ones I'm less confident in and would probably reanalyze a little bit when they're starting from 1 meter per second away from a sprint. Okay. But what I always think is really important is to then think about what you're going to show the coach, what you're going to go show the staff, to make them understand what you mean when you talk about different types of sprinting, different types of lead-ins and so on. So what we've done is we took those sprints and we made 2 categories. We had the slow lead-in, which was a lead-in time of greater than 5 seconds. And then we had a quick lead-in or explosive lead-in, which was less than 5 seconds. And we can go show this to a coach and sync it up to a video. So in this case, I want you to pay attention to the player in the red square. This is going to be a slow lead-in. You're going to see in the graph on the left in real time their speed trace. So we can see this is a slow lead-in. It's walking. So it gets quicker and quicker as they follow the play. Ball gets closer to them. Then to keep up with the play and try and get involved, they're sprinting. Okay, and that might not be, if you showed that to somebody, they might not actually think that's a sprint. It's hard to tell from this distance as well that the player is actually going quick there, but if they have in their head that traditional sprint from a static start, that might not be considered a sprint, versus the quick lead in, to watch the player in the red square there. And again, this is our more explosive sprint, closest to what we would see in traditional sprint testing. When they get to that speed really quickly, it's short, sharp. So we're able to break this up into slow lead-in versus explosive. Really, at the moment, it's all been very descriptive, and it's probably stayed this way because it's really to showcase this method or this approach to the practitioners who can then use it. We can do further research with this to actually then answer some questions, okay, or to put this to use. So I'll wrap up. My takeaway messages for this from what we've seen with this case study, I would call it a case study anyway. Players achieve sprints in a variety of ways during competitions. We can combine that lead in with the sprints to get individual profiles. When I write this up as paper, my practical application isn't necessarily going to be the results that I showed, because it's just for one team. It will be saying to people, this is demonstrating what you might see if you take this approach. We've detailed enough in the methods for you to go and apply this to your own data, encourage you to look at identify the profiles within your own athletes, because we've shown how much variation is there. We've showed how it can be categorized, and then people can go and use this or whatever purpose they want, whether it's specific training, whether it's to identify if somebody is more of a, they reach those speeds explosively, slowly, related to their testing and so on. Future research in this space, I'm always keen to add context. So that's great. Can we actually associate lead-in or explosive sprints with certain actions? Are the explosive sprints the more important ones, or are they less important? It's explosive because we're racing against someone, we actually miss out most of the time. So adding some context to it. Still a bit of work to be done exploring the different filtering and identifying the rules on what quantifies a lead-in. I don't think it's black and white. It's never perfect. You can always improve on that. And then throw in decelerations as well. Maybe start to look at how people decelerate from those high speeds or from a range of speeds. So that's it for me. Hopefully that shows how we can take descriptive research and take it past simply, not having a proper research question or we're trying to advocate our results rather than maybe a novel method that we're trying to, having an impact out there for researchers. So that's it.